talking about. So, how many of you know anything about Ireland or about Irish history? Particularly in connection to Britain. What'd you say, Jesse?
Did they like Britain? Because didn't Britain like take over part of Ireland?
Yeah, the history between the two nations is long and complicated, right? So there's no such independent nation as Ireland historically prior to about the 18th century. The idea of Ireland as a unified nation doesn't really exist prior to the 18th century, right? So you have instead this island about the size of New Jersey, and I apologize for the general shittiness of my artistic skills. It's a vaguely potato-shaped island, right? That is divided into 4, sometimes 5 separate kingdoms, right? In the north, Ulster. In the east, Leinster. In the west, Connaught. And in the south, Munster. And these 4 kingdoms, while they share a language and a basic kind of cultural structure, they war with each other as often as they cooperate, right? There is a high king sometimes, but unless there's some big external threat, no one really listens to him. He doesn't have much real power. So, in the 13th century, the exact date escapes me, the King of Leinster gets into an argument with the King of Munster. I believe had somebody, I think he ran off with the King of Munster's wife or something. And is deposed by his rival. So he invites a group of Norman knights from England to come help him get his throne back. The stipulation being that the leader of these Norman knights gets to marry his daughter, and the Normans get to stay and establish a military presence in Ireland. Right? So this is the beginning of a real English presence in Ireland, and English dominance of parts of Ireland. Right? So in the Middle Ages, this really only extends sort of in the area around Dublin, right? The largest city and the capital. So this region is called the Pale. And it marks the early extent of English influence within Ireland. But over time, more and more settlers, Protestant settlers in particular, from England and from Scotland, are moved into Munster and Ulster in a series of what are called plantations. Right, plantations because you are planting people in these regions to farm the land, right? And the local Irish lords rebel and are punished with exile. Meanwhile, more Protestants from the main island of Britain are moving particularly into Ulster, right? Now, by the end of the 17th century, events take a turn that really kind of begin to forge a sense of strong Irish nationalism. In 1688, in the so-called Glorious Revolution, James II, the Catholic King of England, is deposed by his Protestant daughter Mary, and her husband William. And James and his supporters flee to Ireland, where the local Catholic populations rally in support of them. And William's forces chase James and his forces all over Ireland. And then finally in 1689, at the Battle of the Boyne, in the Boyne River Valley, right around here somewhere, James's forces are defeated once and for all, and he and his supporters are sent into exile in Europe. Now, in order to prevent future Catholic uprisings, William institutes a series of what are called Penal Laws. Which are enforced in Ireland with varying degrees of strictness over the course of the 18th century, right? So these penal laws limit things like access to education, voting rights, property rights, right to assemble, and also rights to own horses and weapons for the Catholic Irish, right? So the Catholic Irish are not permitted, for example, to study law. They are not permitted to vote in most elections or to hold office. They are not permitted to inherit property from Protestants, and intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants is made illegal. Catholics are forbidden from assembling in certain numbers. And they are forbidden to own a horse that is valuable enough to be of any kind of military usefulness, right? They're allowed to own things like plow horses or cart horses. And they are not permitted to, there are strict limits placed on their right to own weapons. All of this, right, is intended to create advantages, political advantages for Protestants in the island, right, most of whom are of English descent. And the result of this is that Ireland is then ruled largely by a group of landlords of English descent who become known as the Anglo-Irish Ascendancy. And many of these landlords don't actually live full-time in Ireland. Some of them don't live in Ireland at all, right? They own Irish estates, but many of them, remain in England. Or Scotland, or live somewhere else entirely most of the year, right? And don't pay a great deal of attention to their lands in Ireland. So this tension between Catholics and Protestants really comes to a head in the 1840s. Now, when we talk about Dickens in A Christmas Carol, does anybody remember what happened economically in Britain in the 1840s? What was Britain going through in economic terms?
Depression?
Yeah.
Depression.
There was a serious economic depression in the 1840s, right? And this affected not just England and Scotland and Wales, but also Ireland. Now, Ireland was hit even harder because in addition to this economic depression, There was also a potato blight that lasted for several years. Right, so for about 6 or 7 years, the potato crop failed. And this was the staple food and the staple crop of the poorest people in Ireland. Right, mostly because, potatoes will grow anywhere, right? You drop one in the soil, and the vines will spread out, and you'll have plenty of potatoes. They'll grow in rocky soil, they'll grow in clay, they'll grow in anything. But when they're diseased, right, when they're all dying off, then the poorest people in Ireland had nothing to eat. So this also creates a massive reduction in population. So the population of Ireland in 1840 is about 8 million people. By 1851, it's been reduced to about 6.5 million people. Right, so in a decade, 1.5 million people disappear from Ireland, right? Now, some of those are deaths, but for the most part, what happens is people emigrate, right? People who can't find enough to eat, can't find work, either go to England or to North America or to Australia, right? So, yes, some of this is death from starvation and disease, some of this is also emigration. And the thing that gets people angry about this is that the British government does nothing to help. Right, so the British government in the 1840s was wedded to a fairly extreme interpretation of capitalist doctrine, right? That the market would correct all of these deficiencies, right? That if we just let the free market do its work, well then things will correct themselves, everything will be fine. The so-called invisible hand theory, right? That the market fixes itself when things go out of balance. This was also why it took them so long to pull the country out of depression. So while people are starving in Ireland, British merchants are still exporting grain from Ireland, right? They're taking food that's grown in the country and sending it elsewhere and selling it. And this infuriates, in particular, the more educated classes among the Irish, even though they're the ones who are actually the least affected by the famine. Right? Remember, again, like the famine mostly affects the poor. And those who disappear from Ireland in this period share a certain number of characteristics. So those who die or emigrate during the famine, right, again, tend to be subsistence farmers or unskilled labor. They come from the more rural parts of Ireland, especially from Connacht in the west. And most of them speak Irish as their first language rather than English. Right? Those in the east and the north in particular were more likely to speak English than those in the west. They're also practitioners of an older form of Catholicism that kind of blends Catholic doctrine with paganism and with folk belief, right? So, on the one hand, they are Catholic, they get baptized, they take communion, they go to church, they go to confession. But they also believe in things like holy thorn trees that you can, tie a white ribbon on to talk to angels, and holy wells with healing powers and things like that, right? So what then emerges as these people leave Ireland is a firmly entrenched, respectable Catholic bourgeoisie. Right, so town dwellers become more important, more powerful, more culturally important, and a less superstitious, quote unquote, form of Catholicism comes to dominate, and a much more business-like attitude comes to dominate. Now, in a lot of ways, what's happening is the Dubliners in particular are becoming more like the English, right? More like their Victorian English counterparts. But the foibles of the 1840s and the British government's failure to correct the famine also leads to a good deal of revolutionary activity. So in 1867, we have the first of what come to be called the Fenian revolts. And Fenian is a word that comes from Irish mythology. The Fenians were a brotherhood of medieval Irish warriors. And one of the things that makes this particular name attractive is that the Fenians were not attached to any one of the four kingdoms, right? They drew their membership from all four and fought in defense of all four kingdoms, right? So they were supposed to be this kind of pan-Irish ideal, right, that belonged to the whole island. And of course, as is the case with most of the Irish rebellions of this period, this is violently put down by the British. But these ideas remain in circulation, in particular, the idea of an independent Irish republic. And this notion of a republic becomes a political ideal that Irish radicals fight to enact for the next several decades, right? So let's try to think about, let's look at, on page 692, this Proclamation of an Irish Republic, which was published just prior to this 1867 revolt to announce it. And let's take a look at what kind of values are expressed in this idea of a republic. So can I get a volunteer to read, starting at the beginning, right? We've suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, etc.
We have suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, and bitter misery. Our rights and liberties have been trampled on by alien aristocracy. Who treating us as foes, usurped our lands, and drew away from our unfortunate country all material riches. The real owners of the soil were removed to make room for cattle and driven across the ocean to seek the means of living and the political rights denied to them at home. While our men of thought and action were condemned to loss of life and liberty, but we never lost the memory and hope of a national existence. We appealed in vain to the reason and sentiment of justice of the dominant powers. Our mildest remonstrances were met with sneers and contempt. Our appeals to arms were always unsuccessful. Today, having no armable alternative left, we again appeal to force as our last resource. We accept the conditions of appeal, manfully deeming it better to die in the struggle for freedom than to continue in existence of utter serfdom.
Serfdom, yep. Okay, so we can pause there for a second, right? So how are these grievances expressed here? What do you notice about their complaints here? What are they complaining about specifically?
It seems like they are not being treated fairly.
Okay, yeah, they do not perceive their treatment as fair, right? What in particular is unfair about it or unjust? Are there any particular words that jump out at you or ideas that jump out here?
How he says, while our men of thought and action were condemned to loss of life and liberty,
Uh-huh.
but we never lost the memory of the national and hope of a national existence. Sounds like it's just like no one cares about them as a whole, I guess, or as a country.
Well, let's think about the phrase that we never lost the memory and hope of a national existence, right? Especially the memory part of this. What do we know about Ireland historically? Was there a unified national existence? So what we have here is actually, there is a fiction embedded in here, right? This memory of a national existence is fictive. But it goes alongside with a general rise in nationalism in colonized nations in particular in the early 19th century, right? So, where do I want to go with this? There's a guy by the name of Benedict Anderson. He wrote a book called Imagined Communities. Now, Anderson is primarily a scholar of Southeast Asian history and politics. But the framework that he comes up with for the invention of nationalism is something that can be kind of broadly applied to other situations as well, right? So, essentially what happens is we get these nations that have been dominated by some foreign power that find common purpose culturally together and define themselves against the values of that foreign power, the culture of that foreign power, right? And so their idea of the nation is forged out of their opposition to being dominated by someone else. And what does British dominance look like in this description?
Didn't he say that they took away from their material riches, like their land resources maybe, or their resources?
Okay, yeah, essentially what's been happening, right, is that our British overlords have been taking and taking and taking, right? And we know that they were taking grain away and shipping it out of Ireland during the famine, right, when people were starving. And we also see what's going on here when they talk about the real owners of the soil being removed to make room for cattle. Have we seen something like that before? Think back to earlier in our discussions of Romanticism. What was happening in English and Scottish villages?
Wasn't you talking about that King Arthur stuff? Or
Not the King Arthur stuff, no. If we're thinking about the late 18th, early 19th century, what's happening in English and Scottish villages? What's being removed and what's being put in its place? What's being done to the land in those places? Think back to earlier in our discussions of Romanticism.
Isn't it turning to be like animal pens, like cows and stuff?
Yeah, they're penning in what used to be public land, right, in a process called enclosure, and using it to raise large numbers of livestock, right? So the same things that are happening in rural England and rural Scotland that are driving people off the land and into cities are being done in Ireland, right? The real owners of the soil were removed to make room for cattle, except that the Irish in this case are not being driven into cities. They're being driven, at least as the proclamation describes them, across the ocean, right? They're going to the United States and Canada, they're going to Australia, they're going to England, right? They're being driven not just off the land, but out of the country. And there is at least some evidence that this was the case, right? That people were being driven out of the country. So the grievance here is of sort of people being sent off into exile to benefit foreign overlords who are just using the island as a means to make money, right? Now, it might also be worth talking about the way the Irish were viewed from Britain, which is what the Matthew Arnold piece is concerned with. And in order to give you some context from this, I'm going to show you guys some political cartoons and drawings that discuss the Irish or that depict the Irish from the Victorian period. Now, think back to when we talked about Kipling. What do we remember about anthropology in the 19th century? How did anthropology work? What did anthropologists do, particularly when they were classifying people?
They base your intelligence off of like your features and stuff like
Yeah, 19th century anthropology was very much kind of based on these pseudosciences that based your intelligence on your skull shape or on the shape of your nose, right? Measuring the distance between, the top of your forehead and the tip of your nose, things like that, right? And the whole idea was to break people down into particular racial categories that were then ranked in terms of, levels of intelligence and culture, right? So, there was no real scientific basis for any of this, right? What it was a means, by and large, for these colonialist countries to further kind of dominate and humiliate colonized populations. But what do we notice about this set of drawings? So this is from an anthropology book from the Victorian era. What do we notice here?
That the Irish one, he seems like he has like more of a fat face and a big nose than the Anglo guy.
Yeah, the Anglo-Teutonic, right, the Northern European here, has a big forehead, right, and a sharp nose, and essentially a kind of flatter face, right? What is the author of this text, the illustrator here, trying to which two groups is he trying to paint as similar here?
The Irish and the Black.
Yeah, he's trying to draw a comparison between those two, right? We often see depictions, particularly of the poor Irish, mirroring depictions of Africans in Victorian popular media. Now, I am not trying to suggest that the way colonialism worked in either of those places was remotely the same, or that the Irish experience is a perfect analogy to the African experience of colonialism, right? It's not. There are a lot of differences. But what anthropologists and cartoonists working together were trying to do was put white English people at the top of the hierarchy, and anyone who didn't fit that model lower down on the ladder, right? So to give you some more examples of what this looked like, right? So here we have a cartoon in which we have two Irish people kind of living in squalor, right? What do you notice about their facial features?
They don't look like animals, like a monkey.
Yeah, their faces are ape-like, right? Their heads are enormous, their bodies are skinny. They're depicted as kind of sitting in a tumble-down shack, right? What do we have lying in the corner over here? Yeah, an empty booze bottle, right? And what's the man wearing on his head? Is he wearing a hat? Yeah. Yeah, he's wearing a kettle on his head, right? And here we have a cartoon directly related to the publication of this proclamation. The proclamation was published in a newspaper called The Nation. And here we have Mr. G. O'Rilla of the Young Ireland Party exulting over the insult to the British flag. Shouldn't he be extinguished at once? And here, a British officer coming to, put him out with a candle extinguisher. But essentially, we have, this proclamation being written by an ape, right? And here we have an ape-like Irishman in tattered clothes, sneering contemptuously, and sitting on a barrel of gunpowder holding a torch while surrounded by his wife and children, right? The point of this cartoon being that he's willing to blow himself and everything he loves up in order to spite the British, right? He's called him the fiend Guy Fawkes. So do you guys know who Guy Fawkes was? Okay, so Guy Fawkes was a Catholic rebel in early 17th century England who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament on a day when King James was going to be there, and failed. So I think it's in October every year, on Guy Fawkes Day, British people set off fireworks. But yeah, so he's the fiend Guy Fawkes because he's sitting on top of a barrel of gunpowder. But yeah, if you look up the gunpowder plot, that'll give you some context for Guy Fawkes. It doesn't particularly matter for this class, but just so you know. So the usual depiction in British media that we see here of the Irish is a negative, animalistic, selfish, poverty-stricken stereotype, right? Now I'd like to look at a different kind of stereotyping that happens as well. If we look at the Matthew Arnold piece, starting on page 693. So, the reason I wanted to talk about the whole racial typing thing before we looked at this in detail is because Arnold is participating in that kind of discourse. Right? He's not an anthropologist. He's a poet and a cultural scholar. But when he talks about the Saxon and the Celt, what he's talking about is these kind of racial subcategories of white people, right? So the Saxon, of course, being the English person, the Anglo-Saxon, and the Celt being the Irishman, Scot, or Welshman, right? So can I get somebody to start reading on the bottom of page 693 from, and as in material civilization, he has been ineffectual.
And as in material civilization, he has been ineffectual, so has the Celts been ineffectual in politics. The colossal, impetuous, adventurous wanderers, the pattern of the early world who in primitive times filled so large a place on the earth. Seeing dwindles and dwindles as history goes on, and at last is shrunk to what we now see. For ages and ages, the world has been constantly slipping ever more and more out of the Celts' grasp. They went forth to the war.
Ossian
says most truly, but they always feel.
Okay, let's stop there, right? So let's look at this initial paragraph we get here on the Celt. What words jump out of us here in Matthew Arnold's description of the Celt?
this colossal, that line right there, where,
Okay, this colossal, impetuous, adventurous wanderer. Okay, why did that jump out at you?
it's because they were using very, I guess, detailed words, I guess, kind of.
Okay, try to think about like things that we can fit together into a pattern, right? Overall, is he painting a positive or a negative picture of the Celts in this paragraph?
Sounds kind of negative if he's saying,
Okay. Yeah. What is the essential argument that he seems to be making about the Celts?
But they're big, I think.
Pardon?
they run everything?
Well,
Because he called it the Titan of the early world.
the Titan of the early world, right? So, is he talking about people who still run things?
Mm-mm.
No, what he's talking about is a race of people who were powerful early on but didn't advance, right? So it seems like part of the argument he's making is that the Celt remained primitive while everyone else advanced, right? Right, he argues that the Celt has been ineffectual in material civilization and in politics, right? Right, not only have they not advanced in terms of technology or luxuries or trade, right? They've not advanced in politics. And what do we make of this quote from the poet Ossian at the end of this, right? They went forth to the war, but they always fell. What is he trying to suggest here about the Celts' level of success as a society?
It's really low. Really low.
Yeah, basically he's painting them as a bunch of primitive losers, right? Right? They went forth to the war, they always fought, but they always lost. And yet, if one sets about constituting an ideal genius, what a great deal of the Celt does one find oneself drawn to put into it. Of an ideal genius, one does not want the elements, any of them, to be in a state of weakness. On the contrary, one wants all of them to be in the highest state of power, with the law of measure of harmony presiding over the whole. So the sensibility of the Celts, if everything else were not sacrificed to it, is a beautiful and admirable force. So remember sensibility from when we talked about late 18th century and romantic literature, right? This idea of sensibility as susceptibility to feeling and to sympathy, right? So what he's arguing is that the Celt has a superior capacity for feeling. But why is that out of balance? They may have a superior capacity for feeling, but what sort of thing do we usually oppose to the idea of feeling? What's usually the opposite of feeling? Think about how this might relate to why he thinks they haven't advanced.
Say it again, what was the question again?
What's usually the opposite of feeling, right?
Nonchalant, I guess. Not showing your feelings.
Well, think of it in terms of like something you use to guide you, right? You can let your feelings guide you, or you can let what else guide you?
Your mind?
Reason, mind, right? Yeah. So what he's saying here is that these are a highly emotional people, right? Who are highly susceptible to emotional influence, but not so much reason, right? That what they're lacking is that logical reasoning capacity, which is at best a kind of backhanded compliment, right? That they have genius in feeling and in aesthetics, but in the reason department they seem to be lacking a little bit. Right, there's this story that he tells about the Gauls on page 695. Says the Gauls had a rule inflicting a fine on every warrior who, when he appeared on parade, was found to stick out too much in front, to be corpulent in short. Such a rule is surely the maddest article of war ever framed, and to people whom nature has assigned a large volume of intestines must appear no doubt horrible. But yet it has not an audacious, sparkling, immaterial manner with it, which lifts one out of routine and sets one's spirits in a glow. So what's the rule he's talking about here? What were warriors fined for? Among the Gauls, the Celts of France? What he's saying here is that warriors were fined for being too fat. So warriors were fined for offending people's aesthetic sense, right? For not meeting an ideal level of attractiveness. So what Arnold is saying is, like, in terms of like rules of war, this is fucking absurd, right? This is ridiculous. But isn't there something beautiful about it, right? Isn't there something beautifully silly about it? And Arnold's idea of the Celts is of these people who are kind of fixated on a kind of beautiful silliness, right? With their fairy lore and their holy wells and their thorn trees and all that, right? And I think one of the things we're going to see, and we'll save some of this for next time, the Irish literary revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is in a large part a reaction against Matthew Arnold's view of the Celts, right? Trying instead to form a kind of positive vision of what the Celt is, that is not framed solely through this kind of English lens. So does anybody have any questions here? So I think what we're going to have to do here, I think, is slightly rearrange the syllabus. So I know I said I wanted you to read James Joyce for next time, right? Don't read Joyce for next time. Instead, read the Yeats poems I already assigned you. So I think it was The Lake Isle of Innisfree, The Man Who Dreamed of Fairyland, Easter 1916, and The Second Coming. And I want you to add to that The Stolen Child, and A Coat.
Can you name the other ones again? Or write down the other ones, please?
And only the first 4 of these poems, which are from the earlier phase of Yeats's career, are directly relevant to the Irish literary revival. The other 2 are later and are kind of after he had abandoned that style. But I want us to have a sense of, like, Yeats is probably the single most important Irish writer of the 20th century, perhaps the most important English language writer of the 20th century. So I do want to give us a sense of his whole career. Yeah, Alex.
Are these in this book?
They are in the Green Book, yes. These are in this one. So, yeah, you will only need to bring this one next time.
So I know you said check tomorrow to see if there's a test. It's going to be based off that.
It'll be on the Yeats poems now, not on Joyce, yeah.
Okay.
And then we'll do James Joyce next week. We'll do that next Tuesday. And I'll find something else on the syllabus that we'll be cancel.